Hello everyone and welcome. In this video, I'm going to be making a circa 1900s Edwardian style corset. Why, you might ask? Well, let me just take you back to kind of where it all started. I happened upon this illustration while falling down the rabbit hole of antique fashion magazines. And let me tell you, it can go on forever. But I came across this particular one in a German magazine, and I'm going to put the name on the screen because I don't want to butcher it. And from the moment I saw this beautiful green princess line dress, I knew I had to make it. And thus, in order to make it, I'll of course need the proper undergarments to create the fashionable silhouette of the era. I've already made a pair of combinations inspired by this pair at the Met. Unfortunately, I didn't really document the process at all, so I don't have a video on it. But if that's something you're interested in, drop me a comment and I'll see if I can put something together on how I approached creating them. So I decided to use the truly Victorian 1903 corset pattern for this project. So before I went ahead and traced out my pattern, I did remove the seam allowance that was included. That way, when I traced my pattern out, I had my exact seam lines. I then went in and added 1.5 centimeters to the vertical seams and then 1 centimeter at the top and bottom. With that complete, it was time to cut out some fabric. Now let's move on to the busk. So as you can see, I kind of like to get the more intensive stuff out of the way. So with the bust done, I moved on to the gores. And to do this, I use an absolutely heinous amount of pins to make sure that I'm sewing right on the seam lines of these pieces. Do I end up stabbing myself a bunch of times when pulling the pins out and sewing? Absolutely, but the risk is worth it. So when it comes to finishing the gores, I deviate from the pattern a bit. The pattern just has you, I believe, leave it raw. To be honest, I'm not really following the pattern at all, but I went ahead and felled down the gore seams as well as the vertical seam that's at the front, just to give it a nice clean finish, given that these seams won't have boning covers directly over them to hide all those raw edges. So I'm just gonna lay all my pieces out to visually see what's left. And the rest is basically just a bunch of straight seams, relatively easy. Since I got the busk and the gores out of the way, it should be mostly quick sewing. Now I'm gonna go ahead and just trim off the excess silk taffeta. I left these a little bit longer in case the taffeta frayed and I didn't wanna have to worry about my seam allowance, fluttering away. And with that all trimmed, let's just see a quick sewing montage, shall we? And it's at this point that I lost a game of thread chicken. And so I had to load up some more bobbins. With my bobbin freshly wound, I finished off the seams and it was on to some pressing. And so it was at this point that I had realized that I had totally forgot about the waist tape. Yeah, after I'd so neatly sewn the center back facing down with the boning channel. So yep, broke out that seam ripper, ripped that seam up so I could, actually put some support at the waist. With that crisis dealt with, it was time to trim down some seam allowance and start with the boning channels. Okay, but wait, before we get onto the boning channels, let's just take a moment to appreciate the shaping of this corset. Okay, back to the boning channels. With some twill tape in hand, I'm cutting them down to length, and then I'm going to go ahead and number each one so I know where they go on the corset in case they get mixed up at all. By the way, they did, but not to worry because I numbered them. Now I'm just taking them over to my ironing board to give them a good press in half. The boning channels at the back are going directly over those back seams. To ensure that I'm going straight through the center of the twill tape, I'm basting them in place, going directly through the seam with my thread. That way when I take it to my sewing machine and I stitch from the top, I know that it's going straight down the middle of that twill tape. With all my boning channels now sewn into place, I'm going to go ahead and give the top and bottom edges of the corset a nice trim, and then move on to actually cutting out the boning. The boning channels at the center back get 1/4 inch flat steel boning, and the boning channel right next to the bust also gets a 1/4 inch flat steel bone. The rest of the boning channels will get synthetic whalebone. Now, don't be like me. Don't struggle for an eternity trying to push boning in channels that are too small. I'd realized that I made these channels too small and I refused to admit defeat. And so I struggled in vain to try to get these to go in, but there was no point. They were not going to go in and my wrists were not happy. So don't be like me. Just seam rip it and make the channels just a smidge bigger. Now it's grommet time. So here I am, I'm doing 1/2 centimeter from the waistline on either side, and then outwards from those points, I'm doing 2.5 centimeters until the ends. I like to do the grommets at this stage, that way if I need to make any adjustments to the neckline or the bottom line, I can't think of the word. the hem, I suppose. I can try it on, see if I like it. If I need to make changes, I can do that. Once you've bound it, you know, you'd have to undo that all, and that's not fun. For the binding, I'm using 1.5 inch strips of silk taffeta cut on the bias. With some hand stitching to finish off the binding, the corset's done. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Next up is the petticoat, so stay tuned.